So now let's talk about Project Aurora.
Well, there's some real depth to this one, Shelley, and we're going to struggle. So I'd recommend the listeners and our viewers go to the show notes and take a few moments to read through the piece I put on the Futurum website on this. But really, there's a lot of depth and a lot of deep engineering, and this came out through one of their blog posts. So it was it took a lot of reading for me to go through this. But really, what they're doing is taking some of the security piece and moving that closer to the silicon. And as I commented in my piece, I think this is really important for where the industry is going directionally. I think we've spent a lot of time focusing on ISO 27001 from a compliance point of view. We've talked a lot about the software vendors out there in the space who've driven a sort of compliance message and driven software-driven approaches. Mm-hmm. But as we did a detailed report on confidential computing, this space is emerging and growing of where security is getting closer to the silicon and the firmware, rather than being an afterthought that's bought as a solution afterwards. And I think as we all hear about the ransomware attacks, the cyber attacks, what's going on in the geopolitical environment, I think as the threat landscape changes and becomes more dynamic, the choices that are put in front of CISOs, it's kind of, what do I do next? And what I was impressed with in the HPE piece is they're taking that further towards the silicon and doing that in the factory.
Right.
So that the CISOs don't have to make conscious choices about what tools and how they deploy them. It's kind of always on from an infrastructure point of view because it's built into the hardware. And I think as the landscape gets more scary and we hear more about these attacks, I think that approach is going to be more and more important.
Absolutely. Fred and I just did a webcast on as part of our cybersecurity shorts series. And, one of the things that we talked about is that the cybersecurity landscape sort of feels like it's a game of whack-a-mole that never stops, right? And, you're just over here trying as hard as you can. So I do feel like that zero trust offerings are key, and continuing to make cybersecurity, a primary concern in the enterprise and beyond, I think is something that we have no choice but to embrace.
I think it's a dense subject and there's a lot of ground here. I think the piece we did on Project Aurora from HPE is worth certainly taking a look at, and we'll put the link to that in the show notes. Absolutely. We've also done an even more in-depth piece on confidential computing and how that whole space is emerging. So that's a further read again. Yeah. But if you're interested in that space, definitely double click on those two assets and read further, because there's a lot of material here and a lot of things that people need to be aware of.
And we'll include a link to our research report that Stephen mentioned on confidential computing. We'll include a link to that in our show notes as well.